All right, guys, this is part 2 of how to run a sub 3:30 marathon. In this video, I'm going to talk about how to specifically race to get to that 3:30 mark. I've had a lot of questions about how to get there. People are loving the strategies, loving the workouts, but the big question I keep getting is how do you actually race that on race day? So in this video, I'm going to talk about how to do that without blowing up, throwing up, and getting yourself to that sub 3:30. Before we really dive in, let's hear how many marathons you guys have run. How many of you are you running your very first marathon? How many of you running your 10th, your 20th, your 30th, your 40th? Let me know in the comments down below how many marathons you guys have participated in. Now, as a little bit of a recap, remember to break that 3:30 barrier. You're going to want to be going 8 minutes per mile or 4:59 per kilometer. So before we really talk about how to run that sub 3:30, there are 3 schools of thought that lay the foundation of how to approach it. The first is what's called a negative split. And you've probably heard this before, but to run a negative split, you're having a slower first half, and then you speed up as the race goes on, and the second half is a faster split. So with these 3 schools of thought, which one is better for you? Well, let's ask Olympian Jared Ward. Now, Jared Ward, if you don't know who he is, he made the U.S. Olympic marathon team in 2016. He has quite the professional running history, running many USATF national championships, as well as a lot of top 5 and top 10 finishes in just about every distance professionally. Now, what you may not know about him is he is actually a statistics professor at BYU, my alma mater, and running and statistics go hand in hand in his brain. So what Jared did for his thesis was actually take data and look at pacing strategies and results from a very large and popular marathon where there's several hundred Boston qualifiers every single year. What he did was he took those paces, dissected them, and figured out trends and key things to figure out how to be successful and how to run a good marathon. So what he did was he looked at the St. George Marathon out here in Utah, and he found a few key components. The first thing he found was the more successful runners, specifically the Boston qualifying runners, started more conservatively and sped up as the race went on. Remember, we talked about what that means? That means they ran a negative split from the slower first half to a faster second half. The second key thing he found was runners who went out too fast had to slow down the majority of the time as the race went on. Remember, we talked about that being a positive split, where you go out hard and then you go a little bit slower the second half, whether you want to or not. That's what it is. And the third thing he found was runners who take advantage of the terrain are more successful than runners who just try and run an even split. So let's dissect a couple of those points and elaborate on them a little bit further. Now let's look at number 2, where we talked about runners who went out too hard and then faded at the end. Now, if you go out too hard, you're going to have some problems. Now, for a lot of first-time marathoners and a lot of kind of younger marathoners, this is very common and a very unfortunate result. And you could get away with this in shorter distances, but the longer the race, specifically the marathon and trying to break 3:30, you can't really get away with this as easily as you can other times. Now, when you start too hard, what that means is your heart rate is going to elevate and spike very early on in the race, and you're going to be pushing that upper limit of what you can do and what your body can handle. And the unfortunate thing is once you get to that point, the damage is already done, your heart is already working too hard, and trying to lower your heart rate becomes a challenge. So think of this as your RPM in your car or your truck. When you start too hard, it's like revving that engine and you're pushing that RPM. When you go too hard in the beginning of a race, you're essentially pushing that throttle down as hard as you can, and you're burning up all that fuel that you don't need to burn up at that time. Now let's look at another thing. We talked about key component number 3 was recognizing terrain and using the terrain to your advantage. And I call these course ninjas. So remember we talked about in the last video, I have right up here, we talked about make sure you know the course. Make sure you know where the hills are, the downhills are, the turns, where the aid stations are. Make sure you're comfortable with the course. What a lot of elite runners do, and that I think a lot of amateur runners don't do, is use the downhills to your advantage and use the uphills also to your advantage. Now, what I mean by that is when you have a downhill, it's okay to push a little bit harder and bank some seconds and bank some time on those downhills, because downhills you could run a little bit faster without using as much energy. Likewise, on the uphills, when you recognize that the hills are going to slow you down and you focus on just maintaining your heart rate and maintaining the pace that you need to keep your heart rate where it's going to be, that's where you're going to have a little bit more of an advantage. You can make up that time once you get off the hill or get some more flat ground. But on the uphills, don't try and hammer the uphills because you're working twice as hard to get up those hills. So my recommendations to pace a sub 3:30 marathon are: first, Your race pacing strategy depends on the course. So not to throw shade, because I love downhill racing, but Run Revel is known for running extremely downhill courses, and people bomb down the mountains and they run very fast times compared to people who run on flat courses. So depending on what kind of course you're running on, you're going to want to be able to adapt and prepare adequately. My second recommendation, kind of generally speaking, is go through about mile 10 slower or equal to your race pace, never faster. Now, the reason I say that is because when you go too fast those first 10 miles, you're already pushing that race pace. You're already trying to get under that 3:30 pace. You've already used up all that energy in 10 miles. Well, guess what? You got another 16.2 to go, and you got to duplicate everything you just did and then do it another half time after that. Whereas if you start a little bit more conservatively, go easier the first 10 miles. Now, I'm not saying walk the first 10 miles, but go a little bit easier and turn it into just a 10-mile warm up and then a 16-mile run at marathon pace. You're more likely to have success when you do that conservative start. The third recommendation I'd have is focus on running smoothly and hitting your target pace, specifically during those miles 11 through 20. That's where races and PRs are made. Now, if you start conservative and you really hit 11 through 20, and then you push that last 10K with whatever you have left, you're more likely than not going to have a PR and you're going to break that 3:30 barrier. So know before you go. Starting conservatively means running brave. I know a lot of runners, and me personally, I get into my head quite a bit when I'm running a marathon. I start doing the math in my head. I start looking at my watch more than I need to. Be patient. Trust your training. Trust your body. Run brave. Run fearless, because running a little bit conservative takes a big act of faith. You have to trust that your body is going to be able to turn that switch, and you could run faster when you need to. Another thing to remember is hit your nutrition and hydration hard the first half of the race. Now, don't drink when you're thirsty, because at that point it's too late. You need to take nutrition as soon as you start and hit those marks, typically between 30 to 45 minutes, every 30 to 45 minutes during that race. Well, you need to take fluids, you need to take carbs, keep fueling yourself, because as the race goes on, that glycogen storage and that fuel storage is going to keep depleting. But each time you add a little bit more there, you're slowing that bleed down. You're going to do a little bit better at the end of the race where you're too tired to take nutrition and you're just trying to finish. Lastly, it's important to remember that the majority of marathoners will have some kind of mental and physical discomfort at some point in the marathon. Guys, a marathon is not meant to be easy. Marathons are challenging. It is not only a physical feat, but a mental feat. When you are running a marathon, you are running a long distance for a long period of time. You're doing something that the vast majority of the population has never done and never will do. It's really important to accept that the pain is going to come, accept that there's going to be some discomfort. Marathons are not going to be easy. And no matter what pace you're shooting for, it's going to take a little bit of digging deep. You need to expect that the discomfort is going to be there. You need to embrace it when it comes there, and you need to overcome it. When you do those three things, when you expect it, you're not going to be caught off guard, and mentally you're going to be more prepared and stronger, that you're going to be able to push through it and get through that barrier and push through that pain and hit that sub 3:30 mark. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, congrats. You guys are awesome. Be sure to hit that thumbs up button, hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And if you haven't checked out part 1, the link is right above me, or you can go down to the description below and find a link to the first part of this video where I talk about the workouts and strategies you need to break that 3:30 mark. So we'll see you in the next video.